we were warned for years that this was the conservatives' goal, their holy grail. They wanted to have a right-wing anti-abortion majority on the U.S. Supreme Court that would strike down Roe v. Wade. And it wasn't just abortion rights activists warning us, but also Democrats at the highest level of American politics, like my former boss, Hillary Clinton, in her campaign against Donald Trump.
When Donald Trump says, "Let's make America great again," that is code for let's take America backward, back to a time when opportunity and dignity were reserved for some, not all. Back to the days when abortion was illegal, women had far fewer options, and life for too many women and girls was limited. For too long, issues like these have been dismissed by many as women's issues, as though that somehow makes them less worthy, secondary. Well, yes, these are women's issues. They're also family issues. They're economic issues. They're justice issues. They're fundamental to our country and our future.
Joining us now, Mini Tamaraju, president of NARAL Pro-Choice America, also Imani Gandy, senior editor for law and policy at Rewire News Group and host of the Boom Lawyer podcast, an excellent podcast I highly recommend. Mini, I'll start with you. What do ordinary people do right now? If you support abortion rights, what do you do right now?
Right now, I mean, you get involved, you get engaged in a myriad of organizations across the country. I mean, personally, I'll pitch NARAL Pro-Choice America, but there are abortion funds, there are independent clinics, there are activations happening in all 50 states across the country. Ordinary people who aren't connected to any of our organizations spontaneously showed up at capitals and courthouses across the country. And it's that kind of momentum and movement that we're hoping will drive some real change this year, particularly into the midterms.
Imani, it feels like the warnings were ignored. You know, there were a lot of folks, if you brought up The Handmaid's Tale, they were like, oh, you are overreacting. It is not that. We are not there. How should the folks who said you're overreacting feel today? Why didn't we listen to the warnings?
The people who said that we were overreacting should feel like fools. And I think they should feel like fools because they refused to listen to the people who saw what was coming down the pike and who had ideas about how to stop it. And I'm talking particularly about Black women organizers in the South, right? For example, there was a push for a personhood amendment in Mississippi a decade ago. And a decade ago, reproductive justice organizers like Lori Bertram Roberts on the ground in Mississippi, they were saying we need to combine this personhood measure with this other measure, a voting rights measure. They were trying to pass a voter ID law. And, people were saying, oh, well, fine, we can maybe focus on the one thing, but not the other thing. And Black women were saying, no, we have to focus on all of these things because they're all connected. And so here we are 10 years later, looking for what to do, looking to organizations and people and asking, what can we do? What we can do is we can listen to the people who have the solutions. And those people tend to be people on the ground. They're abortion providers, they're abortion fund organizers. And it's frustrating. It's frustrating to feel like you've been ignored and patted on the head for a decade. And now here we are and everyone's freaking out.
Yeah.
It's like, I hate being right all early. It's really lonely when you're right about stuff really, really early on and you're like, this is an emergency. And people are like, sit down, little girl. Like you said, you get patted on the head. Minnie, one of the thoughts I've had today also, and Elie Mystal was making this point on Twitter all week long, there's been a lot of focus on the fact of like, in the future, there could be more rights at stake, like marriage equality or even just gay rights based in Lawrence v. Texas. But right now, as we sit here, reproductive freedom is the one that is potentially being taken away, not the hypothetical scenario in the future. And while that is important, what are abortion providers, activists, people who do support choice, what are they doing on the ground right now to help those pregnant people who in nearly half of American states will have to face the fact that abortion could be banned very soon?
Ellie makes great points. A big fan. I think we absolutely have to be focused on the rights at hand now. And I think the good news is most Americans are. And I will say the advocates for those other organizations and communities are also focused on repro. I've heard from a lot of them this week, and they're like, we need to take your lead. What's your messaging? We need to talk about reproductive freedom as an issue beyond the women's community and pregnant people, but a fundamental freedom, a fundamental constitutionally protected freedom that affects every single one of us in this country. So it's really important. What can they do? What are we doing as a movement? As Imani mentioned, abortion funds and providers are taking the lead in creating this incredible network where we can get pregnant people from point A to point B, from a state where there's a ban, where the state there's a crisis, to a neighboring state. It's complicated work. It's expensive work. So strongly encourage folks to give money to those organizations. And then what those of us who are on the strictly advocacy side are doing is making sure we're talking to folks like you, but we're also coaching and training our elected officials on how to adequately and properly address the moment and the issue and how to message it effectively. There's a lot of miscommunication out there about what's happening. Abortion is legal, but we have a big fight ahead. A lot of Americans don't know what Roe is. They don't necessarily understand the constitutionally protected freedom they're losing. So we really have to do a better job of getting that message out. But it starts with the network of providers and the funds. And then I think there's an opportunity for us to raise awareness.
So, Imani, I talked to Elie Mystal this morning on the radio, and we all follow him and pay attention to him and have read his book, Allow Me to Retort. But one of the things he has pointed out is that conservatives like Tom Cotton and others, they're always like, I'm a textualist, I'm an originalist. And I go, I'm a black woman. But beyond the point, beyond that point, if you actually look at the text of the original Constitution and you do an originalist analysis, forced birth is unconstitutional, whether you look at the 8th Amendment or even the 9th Amendment, which conservatives love to ignore. So lay it out for us. What is the best constitutional case based in the text for protecting abortion rights in America?
I interviewed Elie Mystal for a piece, and I asked him why it was that he saved his discussion for the 9th Amendment until the very end of the book, because I always go to that first, because as you said, conservatives like to pretend the 9th Amendment does not exist, and that's the amendment that says that unenumerated rights are retained by the people. Unenumerated rights, like the right to bodily autonomy, that is retained by the people. But Elie pointed out to me that you don't even have to talk about the 9th Amendment because conservatives hate it. Let's meet conservatives on their territory, right? Let's talk about the 8th Amendment. His chapter on the 8th Amendment was extremely powerful, particularly the way in which he kept talking about the fetus as a state's interest, right? You are requiring women and pregnant people to gestate the state's interest. You're requiring women and pregnant people to have nutrients leached from their body that can be absorbed by the state's interest. And then ultimately, you are forcing women and pregnant people to give birth to the state's interest. And then I always like to add after that, then you tell the women and the pregnant people, you're on your own, right? We can't even get a month of parental leave. We are forcing people to have babies and then saying you have to go back to work 30 days later. Childbirth is difficult. And I just want to point out, one of the things that that people love to say, that anti-choicers love to say, is they love to talk about slavery, abortion as being like slavery or like Black genocide. Well, actually, the anti-abortion position is more like slavery, as Elie points out in his book, right? We have the 13th Amendment that says you cannot force labor. What is childbirth? It's literally called labor. It's called going into labor. So it seems to me not only does the 13th Amendment apply, but the 8th Amendment against cruel and unusual punishment applies. And moreover, I'm back to my point about Black genocide. It just seems to me that given the Black maternal mortality rate in this country, and given that the maternal mortality rate in Mississippi is 75 times worse for Black women than it is in the country writ large, it seems to me like forcing Black women to have babies, that's the real Black genocide, because Black women are going to die. Black pregnant people are going to die.
And it's all
I
connected,
love the constitutional analysis. Oh, jump in, Minnie, really quickly there. Go ahead.
So it's so important to connect the dots between the failure of paid family leave, the inability to pass universal pre-K, the inability to pass universal childcare, the COVID crisis, the caregiving crisis, the sandwich generation, women dropping out of the workforce. It's all connected. And in this moment, in this crisis, where American caregivers, parents have been told, screw you, by all the institutions, we are now going to reverse Roe v. Wade and put everyone at risk. I mean, it's incredible, and you can understand the rage that it's tapping into. It's more than just Roe. It's the deep frustration in this country for all of us who have to caregive, for the absolute utter disregard for our ability to do it.
It's so true. When I think about the climate crisis, I'm like, so you're just going to make everybody have kids and we haven't addressed the climate crisis? Like, what kind of world are they growing up in anyway? It just feels like it's not connecting for some of those folks. Minnie and Imani, thank you so much for being here. Please stay safe. Hi, I'm Zerlina Maxwell. Thanks for checking out our channel on YouTube. You can see more from Zerlina by clicking any of the videos on this screen, and make sure you subscribe below to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. Thanks for watching.